Cece, did the other day, John, you were asking him what was the only bony attachment for the shoulder. Did he ever talk to you about that?
No, he did not come back. But we are supposed to have a meeting, I think, tomorrow. And so we'll review it then. But that question came up because we were doing an mock initial assessment. And do you remember the situation?
Yeah, there was some, we were testing him in abduction, not horizontal, but, from the sides, like the angel position. And we were testing some of his like scapular movement because he has a history of some shoulder injury on that right side. And he had a slap lesion on that side.
Oh, that's right. So I was having him go through some movement patterns and I was like, hey, did you ever have an injury to this shoulder? And he's like, as a matter of fact, I did. And so anyway, the conversation continued. And then at one point, he's a new coach with us. So I was like, John, what is a piece of trivia. John, what is the only bone-to-bone articulation that attaches the shoulder girdle to the rest of the body? So the shoulder girdle being the clavicle, the scapula, and the humerus or the upper arm bone. Yeah.
So we're talking about that. So.
And the answer is?
Well, I say the sternoclavicular joint, but Ryan would say
the SCCC joint, the three C's. The sternocostal chondral clavicular joint.
That's a lot. I mean, that's for shoulder stuff.
The shoulder stuff. That thing right here.
Yeah, I wanted to talk about shoulder stuff today. That conversation I heard sort of in the background, and I wanted to get back to it because we haven't really talked about the shoulders in a long time. I actually did a podcast with Caleb at one point and was how to build like rock solid shoulders. And that goes back a little ways, but it's that time of year where people are starting to move again. As per usual, we're doing this stuff and they're going at it a little harder than they were because they maybe had some time off or whatever. I know I was in here yesterday. I was trying to move a little faster. I was sort of inspired by my new buddy, Andrew Siepka, who's out in Hawaii. And he posted some stuff just about where he is in his training block. And one of those things is he's moving lighter weight faster. And he was doing some sort of power snatches with the kettlebells, double kettlebell power snatch. And he was moving really quick. I'm like, I can do that. I haven't done that in a long time. I haven't done that in a long time. And it's the 16 kilo. The kettlebells is 35 pounds for people that don't do math too good. And actually, I was able to move them pretty well because I had been doing quite a bit of hinging and swinging and some cleaning. I just hadn't really gone, and I've been doing single arm snatches with the weight. So I was like, I'm just going to give it a go.
Well, you do your mace warm ups too,
and the mace is now pretty much a staple in all of my upper body warming up, specifically for my shoulders. So I was expecting today for my shoulder, my one shoulder, because I actually have two slap tears I have one in each shoulder. But I was expecting the one side to be pretty sore today and actually feel pretty good. And the reason I bring that up is like I was going a little harder. I was feeling inspired. Not expired. But I was feeling a little bit inspired and I was like going to go. And I think a lot of people are kind of feeling that from time to time right now. They're seeing something, fuck yeah, I need to do that. I did it and it probably wasn't super smart, but I did it and it felt great. But it also has gotten me into trouble in the past. But in review, one of the things, and I'm just going to go back actually to what this conversation I was having with Andrew, who was recently on the podcast, and him saying like, I never wanted to be one of those guys, those old guys that said, always talks about what they used to be able to do. He never wanted to be there. He always wanted to be able to continue to do things that he loved doing, and that's kind of always been my philosophy. Albeit there are things that I know I am limited in getting done these days, but people are getting out there and they're doing stuff. Shoulders are a big deal. I want to talk about shoulders, specifically overhead stuff, and building very strong overhead movement or building very strong overhead strength. And the challenges that exist, I think there for folks, particularly as they're getting on, and because I don't know a person, to be quite frank, who hasn't had a shoulder issue at some point in their life, if they've been active, right? And the person that hasn't been active has a shoulder issue. They just don't know about it. And if they were active, it would probably rear its ugly head based on a lot of the things that we see and deal with sort of on a regular basis. So shoulder stuff. I just want to get into that today.
I love shoulders. It's one of my favorite body parts to talk about.
You're a fucking nerd when it comes to this, which is cool. And I love it too, because again, going back to like the specifics, there's a lot of things to know about the shoulder. I mean, We just, use some anatomical language in here that probably confuses people. But in that, not to confuse people, I think one of the things to understand about the shoulder and what gets people into trouble is they don't understand how complex that thing is. I mean, we should talk about that. And one of those things being, by nature of the way it's put together as compared to the other joints or joint systems in the body, it's super unstable.
Yeah, so you have a lot of, stability that's sacrificed for the mobility of the shoulder. So if you think about the ball and socket joint of the shoulder and compare it to the ball and socket joint of the hip is very stable, and that socket is a lot deeper than the socket in the shoulder. Whereas with the hip, you don't have that much mobility as much as you do with the stability.
Yeah, that's exactly my point. And people like that, I don't think they really maybe put that together. The way it was described to me early when I was trying to understand anatomy and sort of that joint in particular, I can go way back. This guy's name was Lenny Parasino. Nobody listening to this will know that name or remember that name unless you're an old dude, really old dude. He was a physical therapist and a bodybuilder back in the day. I really liked this guy, but I was sitting in a class one day and we were going through all kinds of stuff, functional anatomy. And the way he described it was this, like where you have, people can picture this because they've seen a skeleton before at Halloween, or whatever in science class, but you have that deep ball and socket joint that the hip is, right? And you can just see the thing just rotates, it naturally fits in there and it rotates around. It fits perfect for you as the human. Some of us are not so perfect or not so perfect anymore, but it makes sense. You can visualize that. Well, when a lot of people you could refer to the shoulder and head of that humerus as a ball and socket joint. It looks very similar, but they are not created the same. And the way he described it is, while the hip is that deep ball and socket joint, the shoulder is more like a marble on a dish. And there's a lot of room for it to move around.
Yeah.
I think the way it was explained to me is, think of a golf tee and a golf ball or a baseball sitting on top of the tee.
That's a really good
way
of looking at it.
So the articulating surface, or the surface that it rotates on, is very small, and then the ball or the head of the humerus is very large, and so it's also very shallow. And so in order to give it more depth, the socket more depth, there's a really thin piece of cartilage that goes around the lip of the tee, and that's called your labrum.
Right. And as I mentioned when we started, if you don't treat that thing well, or, even if you are very strong, very stable, have great mobility, oftentimes you can tear those labrums through overhead movements, falling down with an extended arm, or falling with your arm pinned to your side and just falling straight
directly
onto your shoulder. Done all of those things. One of those tears, I'm pretty certain I know exactly when it happened. But I've had so many traumas over my years. I don't know when the other ones happen. I just happened to be getting MRIs because I had this one thing happen, and they popped up, and I was like, "Well, that makes sense." And they usually say, don't they, Cece? They usually say if you got a slap tear on one side, you probably have one on the other too.
Possibly. I don't remember the percentage.
I think the percentage is pretty high. So anyhow, you can tear that labrum. That's one of the things that'll happen be due to the instability or the trauma. A lot of people refer to the rotator cuff. So if we kind of started on our way in, I don't want to bore people with an anatomy lesson, but everybody wants to talk about, I got a rotator cuff problem. Do you though? I think that's kind of the default. And I think a lot of the default comes down to, one, people trying to self-diagnose. The other thing is not getting a full differential diagnosis. They've gone in to see somebody that may be a little less qualified to actually assess if you went in because you had some shoulder pain. And they're just gravitating towards, that sounds like a rotator cuff tear, problem, strain.
Tendinopathy.
Something. But until you dig very deep, until you do this on a regular basis, shoulder pain and identifying exactly where it's coming from or the root of it, it's actually very, very difficult to do. So I think a lot of people just go to it's a rotator cuff problem. So,
yeah. And I feel like though, and we'll get into, the movement of the shoulder, but I feel like a lot of it, the discomfort we can get in the rotator cuff, even if it is acute or localized to tissue that is near the rotator cuff, a lot of times, even if it's, there's maybe a tendinopathy, it's from dysfunction in the movement of the shoulder a lot of times. So it's overstraining that specific small muscle that's trying to stabilize the shoulder, but it might be the movement of the shoulder blade in your overhead movement or in your throwing or in whatever you're doing. It's not actually that, that rotator cuff just needs to be strengthened to all hell. It needs to be improved motor patterns and movement.
Yeah, what's the root cause? Or, is it the chicken or the egg? Was it the rotator cuff that's a problem, or is it your lack of mobility, strength, and your inability to control that range of motion or whatever, all those things that created pain that may be coming from the rotator cuff specifically, but it didn't start there. That's just how it manifested in the end. So lots of things. So we talked about, what does it look like at the skeletal level? You've got the humerus, the head of the humerus, and then you've got the you've got the scapula there, where you've got that cavity that you described. That's sort of like the golf ball on the tee, which is attached to the scapula itself, which then has some other stuff. So if we kind of look at all the moving parts, we have the clavicle, which fits into there.
Collarbone.
Yeah, we have the collarbone that fits into there, right? And then we just mentioned the larger bone there that's very thin. It's kind of triangular shaped. Looks like, I guess triangular shape is that scapula. And then there's
your shoulder blade that sits on your back.
Yeah, and that just floats there, just hangs out.
Atmospheric pressure and muscles are what keep it on the back. So
it's very unique to us humans. I mean, primates have it, but it looks a little bit different. But
Yeah. I mean, the other thing that we should talk about too is the biceps in and of itself, because, we're talking about shoulder pain and what people are experiencing. So is it coming from the rotator cuff muscles, or is it coming from the biceps, or is it coming from, a bursa sac, which is a fluid-filled sac that helps with articulations in the shoulder joint? But going back to the biceps and the biceps tendon, specifically the long head, that attaches at the glenoid labrum, that thin cartilage that goes around the socket. And that biceps has a really critical role when it comes to moving your arm overhead. So that biceps helps with what we call humeral head depression. So that means keeping the head of the upper arm depressed when you go into overhead motion. So it's not banging into the socket or into your shoulder tip bone, which is called your acromion. So it is a critical part.
Right. So that biceps tendon runs through that bicipital groove, which is right there at the top as it attaches to the tendon. And if it keeps banging in to the top of that thing, then you can imagine what's going to happen. It's going to get irritated and pissed off. And so people feel pain, right? And oftentimes it's biceps tendon pain because it's just irritated and pissed and pissed. And it's not because your biceps are weak, right? Or it's because you have poor shoulder mechanics. So yes, biceps could be weak, but there's a lot of things going on here. So as we get into building good overhead strength, right? And good, which would include good mobility and stability, it's important, I think, for people to understand this, like what's going on at the deepest level. Because when you see guys get off the bench press, right? When they get off the bench press, and the first thing they do is they get up and they grab their shoulder, right? And they twirl their arm around in the air with the opposite hand on the shoulder. Oftentimes, if you just took your finger and you just dug down right on the top of that humerus, that humeral head, or kind of like right where the humerus enters into the scapula there, it's like touching a hot nerve. It's like, and that is the biceps tendon. A lot of times that thing has just gotten pissed off because of poor shoulder mechanics. We're constantly loading it. It's never getting a chance to relax. And then when we go do shoulders and we don't have the mobility and the stability we need they need in order to move that thing without pissing it off.
So mechanics, but also then let's talk about muscle imbalances too. So if you don't have a quality, I guess, muscle strength and I guess, I don't know what's the word I'm looking for, but if you have a muscle imbalance where things aren't being held in the right position by the muscles and stuff like that, then one muscle group can be overworked. So it then does go into some mechanics.
Well, and then I think that's kind of tying, all this stuff like bleeds into itself. If there's shoulder mechanics, but then there's also the strength of the tissue to assist or stabilize or co-contract in those mechanics. But so for example, like when we always work the rotator cuff, people see that as an issue. It's not that your issue necessarily your shoulder has an issue rotating all the time. Those muscles need to work and countering with the movement of the shoulder to help pull the head of the humerus into the scapula and work with that function. So there's not compression on the biceps tendon right? Or what's the movement of the tissue around the scapula, which is really important in conjunction with the head of with the humerus, with the movement of the humerus, like serratus anterior, like
lower
rhomboids,
traps,
lower traps, like all these other things that help with the dynamic movement and its fluid and its strength, but also again in that coordinated movement. So
I think it's important to understand that you can have a lot of issues and still have very fucking strong shoulders, right? And very strong overhead movement. And so it doesn't have to be perfect. I mean, you look at, if your goal is hypertrophy or building muscle mass like a bodybuilder, I mean, look, these guys are huge and they might not have great shoulder mechanics. They might be in a lot of pain too. Ask them, if they're not training properly or they already had some underlying issues from something else, it's likely that they do. But you can build great strength and great hypertrophy, or muscle mass with really poor shoulder mechanics and stability and mobility. You can. I think the point of this thing or this conversation is to how do we do it without having those issues if we can. And if we already do, or we're already finding ourselves, or we are finding ourselves a little bit limited, how do we avoid them in the future, right? Or exacerbating what already exists? What are some solutions? I'll say this first. What are some workarounds? And then what are some solutions to maybe overcoming some of this stuff? And so I think that brings us kind of back to your original conversation and talking about John, who has, had maybe an issue in the past. And I already mentioned, I'd be hard pressed to find anybody that's never had some type of an issue with their shoulder. I mean, anybody listening to be like, yeah, there's this one time, sometimes I sleep funny. That's what they'll blame it on. I slept on it wrong, or something like that. Or, when I do this one movement, I really avoid this one movement, this one machine at the gym because it really seems to piss it off. That's a red flag. That's an issue. So something else is going on there that's not so surface level. We just told you in very brief, how complex the shoulder is and how important stability and mobility is in order building strength. So, again, without giving a full science lesson, I guess one of the things to maybe throw out there is what we see very commonly when people walk through the door and they're starting their fitness program, fit or not fit. What are some of the things that you guys see initially is taking somebody through an assessment? And I'll preload this with that they're most often completely unaware of, which I think is the bigger thing that we're trying to do here today, which is create awareness. But what comes to mind for you guys?
As it pertains to the upper body, one of the things that I see most common, I would say probably 95% of the time, is people don't know how to pull properly. When they pull, it's all arm dominant, bicep dominant, and so they aren't using their back. So teaching people how to recruit their back muscles to pull their shoulder blades down and then towards the spine to create some stability before they actually use their biceps is one of the biggest things I see.
Well, and with that, we can talk more about this, but that tends to, when you can't recruit your back in pulling, but you're still trying to pull, that tends to give a lot of that anterior, discomfort on things like the biceps tendon and other things with that superior translation of the shoulder. But I think, it's not that this position is bad in and of itself, but being in a protracted, internally rotated, elevated, everyone's favorite, thing to point to, position in the shoulders and the scapula, but not being able to get out of that. So that kind of ties into that. Not being able to get into a retracted or externally rotated or open position, or not being able to access that, I think is something super common. Yeah,
I think it's just part of it has to do with just a poor awareness of, or lack of awareness of their posture, period.
Yeah.
And this comes from the activities that they do, the activities that they don't do, the equipment that they might be wearing during the day, the type of sports or activities they're engaged in, outside when they're not at work, the fact that they sit at a desk all day in front of a computer, the fact that they just lack general strength everywhere else, their big old head is falling forward onto their, in front of their hips, and their ass is pushing back to counterbalance it, and their shoulders, as you mentioned, are rolled forward and elevated, and they just look like shit, right? There are a lot of people that don't look like shit, yet they still have some degree of this, me included. And so again, there's things that kind of stack on and pile up. But to your point, it's like their posture is not very good, and they can't get out of that because they don't spend time trying, right? And let's be honest, that's not sexy. But if I asked a bodybuilder guy, so here's one of the things that always really fries me, when I'm looking at these physique guys, and I don't, just not to take anything away from what they do, how hard they work. I just want to put that out there. It's just when I look at them, they're very wide, but they're not very thick. And very specifically between the scaps. Like the most impressive dudes to me are the ones that are nearly as wide front to back as they are, shoulder to shoulder, side to side, if you will. And they are beefy and meaty from the traps, from the rhomboids to the traps, right? All the way through those scapulas. So when they're doing a row, it's just like, it looks like they're doing a bench press, back to our horizontal pole. It looks like they're doing a bench press, just big, thick lats, traps, and rhomboids. Those are the big superficial ones that are kind of working in there that help with that retraction, depression, and whatever. But they do a lot of pull downs, a lot of pull ups, a lot of single arm stuff where they're already maybe encouraging poor posture because they're trying to really focus on a specific muscle, which you're going to get more recruitment out of if you take the other muscles out of it, right? Or you don't make them work. One of those ones that I see happening all the time is that single arm kneeling cable row from overhead. Yeah, it's going to help you build your lats. You guys know which one I'm talking about. You're half kneeling, the knee that's down, you have the cable in the hands, single cable, right? And it's pulling your arm up in front of you a little bit, and you're coming back down in the perfect, range or mechanics to really hit and maximally recruit that lat. Okay, great. You've done that, but what you're doing is you're training the shoulder joint, right? Which also includes the elbow and the wrist if you want to put that in there or whatever. But you're training the shoulder joint. And if you're taking all the other muscles of the shoulder out of there, yeah, you're going to hit your lat. But let's stop and think about this for a second. Because if we're not focusing on all the other things and we're overloading this thing all the time, just stop for a second. Do you think that could become slightly problematic? And the answer to me is a resounding fuck yes. Of course it can be. So, when they come in, you got great big lats, you got that V taper and everything looks great, but you're mechanically, you don't look that great, right? You have very tight shoulders. And so when I ask you to be athletic or go overhead into something, you can't do it very well. So again, not to take anything away, if your goal is to get bigger lats, then fucking build bigger lats. Just understand what the consequence of that is if you're focusing on those movements. If you're not hitting in that way, you're not hitting all of the things, right? You're just focused on those things. And that's a movement that comes up in every single physique program, including ours, that's out there. We just try to work around that one a little bit and give you the counters to it as well.
Yeah, so actually that reminded me of a conversation I was having with one of our newer coaches as far as he was programming something and we were talking about the lats and the function of it, but then, the origin and the insertion. And I think for him, when I asked him, I said, so where does, the lat insert? And he looked at me and he's like, good question. And I said, you know what? I want you to walk away, do some research, and then come back and let's talk about it. And then let's talk about the scenario that you presented. So when you're talking about the lat and getting in that position, a lot of people don't realize, believe it or not, the lat inserts into your humerus, your upper bone, right underneath your biceps tendon.
And herein lies the problem, right? So when you go back to what Ryan was talking about with the elevated, internally rotated, shoulders, people call it upper cross syndrome. Somebody coined that term a long time ago. If you want to call it that, you can. But it's sort of a generalized term. People understand what it is. If you're looking at that, then understand that the lats have a lot to do with that. A ton to do with that. They're literally pulling that shoulder down and forward because it's attached to the humerus
and internally
rotating it. So you're if you're only focusing there and you're finding that you got great big lats, got that V taper, you look great with your shirt off, with your tank top on or whatever else, naked in the mirror, whatever else, but you have shoulder pain, that could be a consequence of your big lats. Right? So
and big pecs too that play with internal rotation.
So people are going like, wait the fuck. You guys said you're going to talk about shoulders, but here we are talking about lats, and now we're moving to the pecs.
Yeah.
Which again, we could say all the same things about all the same exercises because when you look in the mirror, what do you want to see? Great big lats, great big pecs. So I mean, anybody that's training physique, that they're very aware of this, right? And they're training those things for the same reasons. Doing pec work, same as doing lat work, and doing it in those isolated ways where you're constantly overloading it and maybe even moving it through a limited range of motion in order to focus, really isolate certain fibers and all the stuff that people like to do. That also can very dramatically impact, shoulder mechanics. So again, got great big pecs. You got that guy in the weight room who's jacked up top, big lats, big pecs, 3 feet wide, 2 feet thick kind of thing. But he can't take his arm over his head. It's likely because he hasn't worked on the things he needs to work on in order to get there. It's not that he's tight. Okay, yes, he's tight. That's a very general term, and I think that's kind of a basic way to look at it, but that isn't altogether true. There is probably some weakness in a lot of area that's being non-permissive, that's creating some non-permissive stuff with that shoulder, and then he's overly strong in other areas, which is, again, his body cannot get out of these positions now. And
so there we go, back to imbalances.
And that's why I'm circling this back is like to what you said, Ryan, which I think is like, if people could take that away from this conversation, that is, are you able to, and how much time do you spend trying to get out of the positions that you're in constantly all day long and into the ones that are going to help you have healthier joint mechanics to take you down the road the long term. I think that's a huge takeaway from this particular talk. So things to think about as you're moving into your shoulder work, like where are my limitations maybe coming from? And so what we said, like, what are some of the workarounds or solutions? Maybe revisit how you're training your back. We're going to get into that. Your back, quote unquote, lats, and how you're training your chest, your pecs, quote unquote, chest, as we go down the line here. So it's interesting. So you were talking about posture. For me, what I see, when we ask people to start moving, you mentioned like not being able to row correctly, right? Or pull correctly. And you mentioned like they're just unable to get out of these certain positions, which is really easy to see right away if you've been a coach for a while. The other thing that I see is they're completely unaware of the dominance that they have on one side over the other, or the limitations that they have over one side or the other, which we can generally pretty quickly and easily see by looking at them from the backside, going through some very, very non-weighted, just body weight movement. That is just lifting their arms overhead in a couple of different directions through a couple of different planes of motion. And you can immediately start to pick things up, like they're overdeveloped in one area or underdeveloped. They have limited range of motion, and how that kind of ties into other things within the kinetic chain that we can almost guess to be issues down the line. And so that, again, I think what it comes back to is that lack of awareness. There's not a program out. I don't think there's like a physique program or a general workout program out there that's like, hey, one of the things we're really going to focus on here is shoulder mechanics in this physique program. They're not doing that. So it's natural to think that people wouldn't know. They drift to the things they're strong at, which ultimately makes them weak somewhere else. So if we're going to start building stuff and we start to see these things, it doesn't mean we can't go overhead. I hate it. I hate it when I hear practitioners or coaches say, well, if you can't do this, then you shouldn't do that. I think there's an element of truth in that, but it always fucking depends. Yeah. And so we should talk about that. Again, like I have slap tears, both shoulders. One of the therapists I saw once, you should not go overhead. That was the worst. And I was treating it very conservatively because this one was bad. It really limited me. It took me out of my game. And when I say bad because it hurt bad. And because any little move, I mean, anything from trying to put on my seatbelt to put on my shirt, underwear, fucking socks, like just brushing my teeth. It was really painful. So I was like, I got to get out of pain. So maybe I should not try to muscle my way through this and listen to what the doctor is telling me and try to be a little bit more conservative. And I did, and I regret that because I probably could have been pushing a little harder and doing things that I then had to unfuck later on down the road. My point of that is like, it could be good advice for a while, but it's not forever. So that one gets my goose when I hear somebody say you should never go overhead. Why? I want to know why. I don't know how you guys feel about that, but that's one of the things that gets me. And I always think there's a workaround to it. Always.
Yeah, I definitely think there's workarounds. But then, overhead, when you say overhead, that's very general. So, I mean, there's a lot of degrees of motion that could be considered overhead. That's not I guess, abducted and straight up overhead. If you were to bring your arm slightly forward into what we would call the scapular plane and then press up overhead.
It'd be totally different.
Yeah, it would be completely different. And then also as far as the positioning that you have your hand, which will, impact your forearm, which will impact then sometimes the internal, external rotation of your shoulder joint. So, or if you're going straight in front of you at an angle, that's still considered overhead, but it's not your traditional overhead, like 180 degrees overhead.
So there's a lot of nuance.
Yeah, there's a lot of nuance. So,
yeah, I mean, I think again, just building on that, there's a workaround. It may be, adjusting the load for that specific mechanic, or again, it's not just that you need to go straight up again 180 degrees overhead, but you should not avoid overhead movements, because I bet in your day you're going to grab someone out of a cupboard and you're going to go overhead, and if you never train overhead and you have no capacity to do so, that's when you'll really regret it. So
yeah, there's a ton of reasons why you would be going overhead. I mean, we're going to be cleaning up all these Christmas decorations, and I'm dreading it, but fucking bins upon bins upon bins of shit.
It's considerably better.
And it's going overhead because it's going up top in the garage, right? Like getting shit out of the compartment in the airplane and things. I get whatever, for whatever reason, I would have no idea why this is, but I get asked constantly, can you help me with my bag? Can you help me get this thing down? I'm like, yeah, because they don't have the strength, right, to get there. They already know they have zero confidence. They don't want to embarrass themselves by dropping it on their face or somebody else's face or whatever else. So these are real life scenarios without getting too far down the road. But the going overhead part and understanding that there are workarounds. So if you're listening to this and you're like, dude, I mean, I know it's not good, but how do I know if it's how do I know if what it is or what it isn't? So one of the things that's real easy, like self-assessment, is the thing we call a wall angel, where, and we actually have a video if you go into the Red Dot Fitness YouTube channel, you go to our library, we have our library there, you get to the mobility videos, and you scroll down there, you're going to see the wall angel video. And we can use this as an exercise, but we also use this as an assessment. And we walk you through there how to kind of do this. But just quickly, what you would do is back yourself up to a wall, get into kind of the hands up position, 90-90 at the elbows and the shoulders. Your elbows, ideally, your thoracic spine, all the way down to just where your lumbar spine starts, and then back to your sacrum is touching the wall, right? You're probably going to have a little bit of gap in your lumbar spine there. Theoretically, you should. If you're a super thick person, right? Whether you have a lot of adipose tissue or you have a lot of muscle mass, it might feel a little different, right? Because you've got that thickness between you and the wall, but you're going to be backed up to the wall. Ideally, like that's what's touching in the back. Ideally, then your both shoulders are touching, both elbows are touching, and both of your wrists or hands are touching the wall. And you're in this hands up position. Let's say you're just below 90 degrees at the shoulders and the elbows. For those people watching, I look pretty silly. But what I'm gonna do then is with my head, just my occipital bone on the back of my head, and then all the things on my back, down my spine to my sacrum, my butt. Again, if you have a big butt, this could also change things up a little bit. So it's not a perfect test, I'm just saying, or an assessment. I don't want to call it a test. It's not a perfect assessment, but these are all factors, right? There's nuance to this. But if I back myself up and I have my arms in that position, and then I took my arms all the way up overhead. So I'm sliding them up again. I'm sliding my arms against the wall. So my shoulders continue to touch, my elbows continue to touch, and my wrists continue to touch without losing contact with any of those things on the backside that I mentioned. Should be able to go all the way up overhead. Ideally, when I say ideally you should be able to go all the way up overhead in this motion to where you can touch your hands with your elbows fairly straight, right? They're not going to be perfectly straight. They're going to be bent if you're going to touch your hands together, and then bring them all the way back down into that position and repeat it without, again, losing contact with the wall at your back or losing contact with your arms, shoulders, and wrists, or your shoulders, elbows, and wrists. That'll give you a really good indication of kind of what your mobility is or isn't. Here's the things that you're gonna feel when you do that. I know for me, again, going to my issues, my right shoulder has way more mobility than my left shoulder does. So as soon as I can get into that position where I'm like back against the wall and everything's touching. As I start to go up, as soon as my left elbow, so my right and left elbows are moving at the same time. As soon as my left elbow starts to drift just above my shoulder, like the plane of my shoulder, that wrist and arm start to pull away. Like that, it feels like somebody is pulling my arm down and away from the wall, while that right one can still stay up as I go up. I have limited external rotation on that left side. And you can see it right away. Like if you're paying attention and maybe you're looking in the mirror or you got your phone set up and you're videotaping, you're going to see some stuff happening. That's the stuff we're looking for as coaches. But you're going to find like, oh shit, I'm really tight there. Or the other thing that happens is I start to go higher with both arms. My back starts to come along away from the wall, my thoracic spine. I'm pushing my chest out to keep my shoulders back because I have limited thoracic extension as well as external rotation as I'm going into this overhead shoulder movement. I won't bore you with all the things that I know about myself, but that's an easy one to get in there and go, and what it's going to be is it's going to be an oh shit moment for you. You're going to be like, oh, fuck, I didn't know that. It's a great way to get sort of an initial assessment on kind of where you are. And then you can put some work into some things and keep coming back to it and reassessing, like, am I getting better? Am I not getting better? Am I getting worse? What's happening here? I think the most important thing to take away from that is this should be slow, controlled, and you have to be hyper aware of what your body is doing and all those things that I just said. Because like, oh no, I'm fine. Yeah, but your butt is now away from the wall. You're basically like in an inclined press position. That doesn't count. Right? That doesn't count. You overcompensated. You had to find the mobility somewhere, and you did that by you basically did that by going into or by pushing your hips forward and not having to get that overhead position because you lack external rotation, right? And some level of shoulder flexion. So in some cases. So anyway, there's a video that you can go to the Red Dot Fitness YouTube channel. You can check it out. It's in the mobility library and it's called the Wall Angels. We have a ton of stuff in there we can talk about later, but that's a good way to kind of assess like, where is my shoulder mobility now and how might I attack it, going forward. That was a long explanation of my own shoulder issues. But I don't know. What do you see when you take people through Wall Angels, man? Or what do you think's hard for them?
Well, I mean, first is I cannot tell you, especially where we live in the Bay Area, in the tech area, I can't tell you how many times I put someone on a wall and they can't even get their arms to the wall, let alone trying to get overhead and trying to get into that. Like they can't even touch the wall. So I think a lot of that comes from, shoulder external rotation and that so I almost think the bigger issue is being overly kyphotic or rounded in your thoracic spine. So you'll either see they're so kyphotic, their head can't even touch the wall, their forward head, they can't get into that, we call it axial extension or axial elongation, right? So they can't get into that head back. Or if they try to get the head back, their ribs flare really to a big degree where that extension is just coming from the lumbar spine and not actually elongating from their thoracic spine. So I mean, I can see people don't even touch the wall. They're a foot, 2 feet up. I mean, seriously,
they can't get there.
They can't even get to the wall.
Right.
Yeah.
They can't get there.
Yeah. I'm sorry.
What do you see when you see a common, like an issue in a Wall Angel, or what's something you're looking for?
So they aren't able to horizontally abduct their arms, so pull their arms back towards the wall. They can't even maintain a position to where they can get some thoracic extension where, like you had mentioned, their ribs aren't coming forward and lifting up through the chest. Yep. I would say, that's probably the main thing when I see people up against the wall. The other thing that I like to do for an assessment is have them go into internal and external rotation at the shoulders. So we call it aptly scratch, where you take, let's say your left hand, you put it behind your back, and then you take your right hand and you go up and over your shoulder and see if you can touch your fingers.
No way.
Or
no
at least or at least just note where your fingers land on your back, and then reverse the movement pattern to see if there's tightness, and then compare as far as like the internal and external rotation.
Well, and I think a big one with that is seeing big asymmetries is one side to the other, is because a lot of people aren't going to be able to touch their
here's the thing. I've never been able to do it ever, not in my life, except for maybe when I was an infant. We talked about that the other day in terms of like, being able to squat ass to grass and sit in the, whatever, when we were babies and how flexible we were. But what you'll see when people go to get in that aptly scratch test, when they can't do, what do? They flare their chest. They try to find that mobility somewhere and get those arms back there some way. They're pushing their butt out and chest out at the same time, trying to get all that extension through their back to try to get those hands together. We say all of that to say is this. if this shows up if those types of things show up in the assessment, guess where they're going to show up when you start loading them with weights. Mm-hmm. They're definitely showing up there. All those compensations that we just talked about, the things like the butt moving out, like think about the dude that you see sitting there on the bench trying to go overhead in a military, basically in a double overhead press with dumbbells. He's sitting on the little L seat, right, in the gym, and his ass is all the way out to the end. The only thing that's holding him on there is his tailbone, and he's got the bottom of his scaps pinned against the top of the back of that chair, and he's pressing overhead. What is that? Is that an overhead shoulder press?
No, it's an incline press.
Yep.
It's going back to what you were saying, Cece, it's still a form of going overhead, but it is definitely not a overhead vertical press. Mm-hmm. Are you going to build some muscular strength there? Well, fucking 1,000%. Are you going to build some musculature there? Absolutely. Look at the fucking dude. If it didn't work, he wouldn't look like that, right? I'm not saying it doesn't. I'm just saying, what are we doing, right? And so in going back to the assessment process, like if it shows up there, unloaded, you just trying to control your own body in space against the wall and gravity and whatever other forces are that we don't know about yet that'll maybe pop up in science somewhere. Yeah, when you start throwing dumbbells in there, barbells in there, kettlebells in there, bands in there, balls in there, all that stuff, that's going to show up there. And it over time, you could wind up in an issue. So how do we work around that? Well, part of it is what I just said, only being more aware of it. Like if you have to get your ass that far out in front of you to do an overhead shoulder press, well, then why don't you get on an incline press, right, and start to maybe work that up in a way that allows you to sort of incrementally get a little bit more overhead at a time and being mindful of the loads that you're using to get there. Mm-hmm. Because for a lot of reasons, but, just putting weights over your head and sticking your butt further out on the bench doesn't make a lot of sense to me, at least at this point in my career. And as a human that's done a lot of this in my life, like it just doesn't. I get it. Like if that's what you got to do to do the thing, fucking do the thing. But I know a lot of people are out there doing shoulder presses, whether it's seated or standing, mm-hmm. and you see a very similar type of thing where they push their butt way back and they're arching their back way back, and it almost looks like they can get into so much extension in that back that it looks like a standing incline press.
Yeah. Well, and I mean. And again, a lot of that extension is coming from their low back. So, and then you add axial loads, you add load overhead. And so there's not even a bench to taking that load. So when someone walks into the gym, does an overhead press, and they're like, oh, why does my back hurt? Or why do my erectors feel like they're overfiring? Or why do I feel compressed?
Yep.
Look at your position in that.
Yeah, without getting into too deep the anatomy lesson, that's a really good point. And just like, look, your spine is this S curve. Everybody knows kind of what that looks like. All of those little vertebrae are stacked on top of these little discs. They're all very specifically, basically shaped and cut, if you will, by nature, God, whatever, to be, to sit there and support you. And as you start to extend or flex those things, they don't sit or seat the same way. And you start to load that over time. Spaces get a little smaller, other spaces get a little bigger, some muscles get a little weaker while some muscles get a little stronger. You get it a little rotated because you're a little fucked up at the knee, which then fucks you up at the hips, which then fucks you up at the lumbar spine, then fucks you up at the thoracic or at the thoracic spine. And now everything's a little bit off, and now you throw those loads over your head in that way, and you overcompensate just a little bit, get into that extension to just put that extra 5 kilos or 10.5 pounds or whatever on the bar. And fuck, like something happens. Mm-hmm. Something in that chain is going to give out. And again, you do this game long enough and you play that game, that specific game long enough, it's going to rear its ugly head. So trying to avoid that stuff. So the point there is like, what are the workarounds? Okay, so you mentioned so if you have limited range from that standing position, you could go maybe move to like an incline position where you are supported and you can really work the shoulder position and not have to worry about what's going on down low, and still load those things and quote unquote overload those things so that you get that hypertrophy or that and that strength, and you're setting those, they're working that neuromuscular system the way it needs to be worked. That's a great way to do it. People look at that, but that's an incline press. Yeah, it is for you right now. That's what it is. That's what it could be. That's one way to do it. I know there's another one. You have another favorite one that I see you doing here with clients all the time, which is a little less conventional, but fucking awesome because it still gets the rest of the body involved without having to do. You want to talk about it?
So, I mean, either a landmine, you can do that single arm, or a Viking press. It's so modifiable. And not to go too much into the weeds of mechanics of the shoulder, but we mentioned something serratus anterior. So a kind of uncommon reason I like the landmine or the Viking press is because there's the implement. So right, when we put that bar in a landmine, there's an implement for you to push into. It actually really teaches upward rotation of the scapula in that movement, which is really important when the shoulder blades separate. They kind of upwardly rotate and that serratus fires. It creates a lot of stability. It counters that, that forward shifting of the head of the humerus. It kind of is a posterior tilt, counters that overactive lat, counters that that compression on that biceps tendon. So it teaches that as a mechanic. You can modify it whether you're standing. So it's standing, it might be more like that incline, right? The implement, it's pivoting around, it's more out in front of you. You can get into a kneeling where it's more closer to that overhead position, whether it's a Viking or a single arm landmine. And then another way that it can actually force you in a good overhead position to work on a mobility while also still loading it is you can structure it where you press up overhead and then you change the trunk angle. So you lean into it. And that also can increase the position of your overhead. It can work on engaging those tissue we were just talking about, but it's also stretching your lats, stretching your pecs while you're still getting in that overhead position and getting strong in it. So that's my favorite thing to do. It's honestly, most of the time, it's either an incline press on a bench or I'm getting them on some sort of landmine variation for where they're at. That's like a day one overhead kind of movement for me.
Are you sure it's your favorite? Because it doesn't sound like it at all.
Sorry, I got all ramped up about awesome. The nuance of it.
No, yeah. It's awesome. And that's why I asked you about it, because you made a huge case for it, and I bet most smart coaches out there that understand everything you just said and are probably nodding their head, listening, saying the same thing. Like, it's not the only answer, but it is a great one for most people. Yeah. Most people.
Well, the other thing is too, you have stability with that movement pattern because it is anchored at the floor while the long end that you're pushing up against is moving. So, I think it's a great movement pattern versus, pressing a barbell or pressing a dumbbell overhead. Not that you can't do that, but it adds a stability component to do the things that you just mentioned as far as being able to lean into it, getting some elongation of your lats, of still going overhead, just different.
Yes, for sure.
I think this is one of those ones that every gym should have that's one of these pieces of equipment that every gym should have in the gym. I never really appreciated it till it showed up here. You can do it without the Viking press attachment. You can do it just with the landmine, right, and a single arm. I don't encourage that one with two hands attached to the bar. Like, you can do that. It's not the same, right? Because you're in that internally rotated position. It encourages elevation.
Horizontal abduction.
Yeah. It's not awesome that way. But if you're going to do it single arm, and I'll tell you what one of my favorites is, that's one of those ones you can really load up, right? Because you're putting your body and your shoulders in a very safe position in a range that you can control and still get into quote unquote overhead movement. And so we've got a lot of aspiring, current, and previous, or say retired first responders and military guys that currently did or are going to wear kit, whether they're in plate carriers with any number of things attached to them. To my firefighter friends out there, all the equipment that they have to wear when they're going into and carry when they're going into a particular situation, whether that's medical or a fire call. And then, obviously our police officers, our law enforcement officers that are sitting in cars, right, for a good part of the day, wearing belts and vests and all kinds of, let's just say, prohibitive equipment as it relates to practicing great posture. So if you're spending 8, 9, 10, 12 hours getting held over for a 16-hour shift, right, in that position, again, going back to what are you doing to get out of that position? And so does it make sense for me to ask a guy who is already limited on time, has a wacky schedule, is trying to just manage his sleep and his stress management and his nutrition and all that, to kind of back away from the intensity of his workouts when he's trying to build strength to do these like rehabilitation type movements? No, that's why we're not making this this podcast about that. We get it. You want to lift. You need to lift. You need to stay strong, but you need to stay healthy. And that Viking press is an awesome way to do that. And just to kind of maybe come over the top on that, I think I probably said this before on the show and some other podcasts, and we talked to very specific coaches that work with very specific populations and the populations that I just mentioned there. And one of the first things they say is we don't go overhead very much. And when we do, we use things like the landmine. And the other one is the kettlebell, which I'll get into in a sec here. The landmine, but the Viking press being one of those, because they just don't have that mobility. They never had it, or they're not, or they're not going to get it, in the sense that, not that it can't be returned and they can't get it back somehow. We just don't have the time, right, to put in with all the other things that we're trying to do. And people listening to the show that don't work in those fields, they're probably thinking the same thing, like, man, you're going to make me do all these like internal, external rotation exercises, these stretches, these cars, these, these Aldela postures and things like, well, we'll talk about those. But I get it. Like, look, if you asked me to do all that stuff to unfuck myself right now, I'm probably not going to. So what do? Like, I go to the Viking press. I go to the landmine. The other one I really like is the kettlebell, because of how you're able to load it. Specifically, I really like, and here's another thing. So going back, like, how often do people actually overhead shoulder press in their workout routine during, let's just say, a 5 to 10 day training cycle? Maybe twice. However, they're working their shoulders 5 of those days with their pushing, their pulling, their overhead work, their very specific, delt work, rear delt work, those types of things. So they're working them a lot. I'm just saying, if you wanted to add something in that could really help you with some shoulder stability and mobility, add in some bottoms up kettlebell pressing, like in one of those days. And pay attention, and going back to that scapular humeral rhythm, and you were talking through that scapular plane, how you're able to, where you have to start in order to balance and get through, let's say, 10 to 15 bottoms up kettlebell presses. Pick whatever weight works best for you. How many can you do on each side? Right? Is it even, I'm going to tell you right now, if you've never done this before, you're going to find some serious discrepancies between, one side over the other. I'm just going to challenge your grip in a different way. So you're kind of getting a double whammy there. Mm-hmm. It's really challenging your brain. It's challenging your entire upper body, but it's really challenging your shoulder. And you're able to find the range that works for you and really challenge yourself in that range as you're moving through the entire movement. So you might have to stay way more in this like adducted adduction position to keep it stable. And because the further it gets out away from your body, the more you work into abduction, it gets a little bit tougher to do. So through that bottoms up kettlebell press, you might have to stay again. Well, that kettlebell almost stays right in front of you the whole time. But over time, you'll start to find, like, okay, the next day I may be able to get a little further out, and then maybe load it a little bit more. And all those things are very helpful in teaching your shoulder how to stabilize in all the ways that we've already said, without boring you with all the things that it does or it needs to do, while also training strength, endurance, mobility, and some level of flexibility in there. So I like that one alongside the landmine or Viking presses is one that I don't see a lot of people doing, and I think they should consider.
Yeah. I mean, and that's, if you're bored of working your rotator cuff and all those, different movements, those isolation movements, bottoms up kettlebell is a great way to work, again, those stabilizers, because it's having to dynamically, control that weight, co-contract around it. In external rotation, that's a way more integrative way to work your rotator cuff than just doing these banded exercises all day. It's
low cost and low risk as well. And so you could add this in on a second or third or fourth day of shoulder work, somewhere. You're not gonna crush yourself doing this. But I think the benefit that you get out of it, the ratio of risk to reward there is way higher on the reward side in terms of, like, you're likely not overtraining, because you're not gonna be able to use that much weight, right? It's not gonna be like what you can military press or what you can, double dumbbell overhead press. Right? Not even close, right? There's some strong dudes out there, and I've seen them, but, like, if you watch a dude go out there with the 72-pound, kettlebell and do an overhead bottoms up press times 12, that's some impressive shit. Yeah. But you'll see guys go over and grab hundreds off the racks with the dumbbells, right? And do double overhead presses. While that's impressive, try to get them to do that with that same dude. If you're that guy, dude, go grab a 16 kilo kettlebell comp kettlebell at that. Like that's the ones that are a little bit bigger, right? They're all the same size, or they're all the same size, but they're different densities or different mass. Go grab one of those and try that with that and see how that feels. Tell me your shoulder ain't fucking burning after doing about 12 or 15 of those. And again, try to find the range that you can actually work in and make that work from like the same kneeling or standing positions you were describing, which I think is important to note. Those same positions you were using the Viking press or the landmine for, you can still do them from the same spot. Kneeling, double kneeling, standing,
split stance,
all kinds of stuff. Yeah.
So I wanted to mention, I think, 2 more things. One to note with any press, so whether it's with a kettlebell, landmine, or a dumbbell, I love getting in a half kneeling. So basically you have one knee up, one knee down. Especially if you find that you get that too much extension in the low back. When that one knee's up, it helps put your pelvis in a more neutral position. It's harder to get into a lot of extension.
There's a counterbalance there.
There's a counterbalance, and that one side being in hip flexion helps the other one not get into too much overextension. So I love that. Another movement with the kettlebell, building on the bottoms up kettlebell press, is just a standard like from a front rack kettlebell press. I like that. There's a little bit more going on. There's some rotational components to that. So in some ways it can be more advanced depending on the individual. But I do like in the overhead position, because the weight's a little posterior, it's a little bit behind, it can actually help kind of almost load you more into the overhead position. And even if you're not perfect in the up overhead position, there's still some better joint alignment is where the load is compared to your actual shoulder joint. So that's another one to build onto if you've ever seen like in a front rack position into a press overhead. And then you can start building into the dumbbells, the barbells, things like that.
Yeah,
so
I love that. Like, again, if you have a home gym and you only had a few kettlebells, there's so many things you can do. There's so much utility in the kettlebell. But really, really great example. So you got like, those are some solutions for going overhead, maybe going overhead more often or more frequently, still keeping it loaded despite maybe some of the issues that you might have as you're working to increase strength, increase range of motion, mobility, and so forth. So I like those. Now, I promise we wouldn't bore them with all the rehab stuff, but if you really want to get better shoulder mobility and range of motion, there are other things you're going to want to consider. Cece opened up with one of them right from the get-go. Learn how to fucking row properly and pull properly.
Horizontal and vertical pulling, I think, is really critical. Usually, anybody that's new to Red Dot Fitness, I'll start them with horizontal pulling, and then we'll transition into vertical pulling. I like to think of the shoulder blade as the shoulder's base of support. So when we think about squatting, we typically think about our feet being our base of support and being in contact with the ground, creating a nice, wide, stable base. So when it comes to the shoulder and creating stability, I like to think about the shoulder blade and then all the muscles surrounding the shoulder blade that create movement, that work together. There's the co-contraction of the muscles that help to create stability through the shoulder blade's range of motion. So the shoulder blade moves up, it moves down, it moves towards the spine, it moves away from the spine, but then it also glides on the ribs forward and then it slides backwards. So all of those movement patterns, they work together when we do overhead motion. So when I say overhead motion, I mean specifically overhead motion at the shoulder. So our ball and socket joint, moving our arm straight out in front of us and then up overhead. And so that's called shoulder flexion. And when we have shoulder flexion, the shoulder blade moves to accompany the shoulder flexion. So there's a range of motion. It's called a 2-to-1 scapular thoracic. Glenohumeral. Oh my gosh, I'm totally blanking.
I'm trying to see what you're referencing.
2-to-1 scapulohumeral rhythm. It's 2-to-1 scapulohumeral rhythm. So what that means is for every 2 degrees that your arm comes up overhead, there is a degree of range of motion of the shoulder blade. So we've got to create stability around the shoulder blade before we can go overhead.
That's
or to go
really
overhead efficiently and effectively. I would say 80 to 90% of all shoulder joint pain is generally because there is an improper biomechanic or movement pattern with how the shoulder blade is moving. So,
outside of some acute trauma that they might have had.
Outside of some acute trauma.
Right. Yeah, I think that right there is super important. So this goes all the way back to like, if you have limited shoulder issues, take a look at how you're pushing and pulling. We mentioned the push piece. if you want to hit that.
Well, and to kind of go back to that, that really popular kind of rowing where you are isolating the shoulder blade and not getting any shoulder blade movement, and you're only getting, the arm or the humerus moving to focus your lat. Yeah, it's great to isolate your lat, but from a functional standpoint of you're not learning to move your shoulder blade, right? Which in every functional movement, in every movement throughout the day, whether you're throwing, punching, reaching, grabbing something, the shoulder blade needs to move. So again, you're doing all these isolation stretches for your chest and pec and lat, but you're not actually moving your shoulder blade in your exercises ever. So learning how to dynamically do that. And I think, there's so much, that's probably one of the most common things I need to teach clients. The sequencing of it, the movement of it, depending on what's the intention, knowing that you can move them independently and in conjunction with each other. So I think that's being able to separate that, right? You can move the scapula with just into protraction, retraction, depression, where the humerus isn't really moving except, it's in the base of it. And then you can pin the scapula and move the humerus, move things around it. But then it can be very integrative and where they're moving in unison in a punch and a throw, or a lot of what you're rowing and pressing should also implement. So.
Yeah, I think the big takeaways there are, one, like the scapula needs to be able to, you need to be able to stabilize the scapula before you start getting heavy overhead movement, because you're going to compromise things down the road. It's a weak link in the chain. Yes. So that was one of those things. The other part that you said there is go ahead, let's start loading it. Let's get it to move. Let's not be afraid to do that. And again, that goes back to what I was saying before, like you should never do this, as an exercise, as it's coming from some coach or practitioner or something else. Like I that's just not something I can get on board with, until you can tell me exactly why. And generally it's out of sense of fear or trying to avoid pain. Yeah. Well, you can only do that so long before the pain comes up some other way. So anyhow, that's one of it. The other thing, what I wanted to keep this to is we're telling people to go move and go lift weights, right? Go get strong, build strong shoulders, but understand where the root of building strong shoulders comes from and what your limitations are going to be. So I see a lot of coaches when they first kind of enter into the business, and then a lot of people as they start to research, how do I fix my shoulder pain? I see a lot of this floor exercise stuff where they go over on the floor. Look, I was guilty of it too, because that's how I was taught sort of coming up. And that is, you got to get on the floor, you're prone, your belly down, you're doing cobras, you're doing, Supermans. Those are all very good exercises to teach somebody how to get and be aware of how to move properly, so that when we do start to load them or get them into more advanced type of movement, they get where it's coming from. That's a great place. But we need to eventually graduate them from there, and they need to be able to lift weights. So if just be careful how long you stay in those positions, right? And you stay with that. How long is that actually an exercise before it's we're beyond this? Yes. You're working with the 10-pound dumbbells basically, when we should be over here with the 50-pound dumbbells, if as a dumb analogy. But we've graduated from here, and we have to continually push, otherwise we're going to regress or stay stagnant.
They're just like any other exercise. They need to be progressively overloaded. And when I even say that, yes, there is okay, you can start loading these. You can use dumbbells, you can use bands, you can use body weight for, with the TRX, all these different things. But I also will graduate that may be an exercise day one, whether it's just scapular retraction, protraction, or Y's, T's, A's, all those different things. But then my first step is, now this is graduated to, this is a warm up. This is a connection. This is you priming that motor pattern, that movement immediately prior to, now you're going to go pull the heavy load. We're not going to stay with
this. It is not life.
Yeah. No, exactly. So yes, do the isolation, but then you graduate it and integrate it into your program, right? So now we can load it over and overload it.
It's the same with that wall angel. That wall angel starts as, an assessment. It might even be an exercise for somebody sort of initially until they can get things back there, or we're using it as an exercise / assessment as a coach, kind of see where they're coming from. But if ultimately you have to move and you have to graduate forward, and I think a lot of people, again, that listen to the show, they feel like they're way beyond that, and they likely are, right? But at the same time, it's always good to kind of go back and revisit, your roots a little bit, and where am I with this? And part of that is, as you mentioned, the term priming, or getting something to, I like to say, switched on, or you can kind of wake it up, and as you're moving into this integration piece, and where those movements kind of fit in there. some of the other things we could talk about there are some of the mobility, soft tissue application, neuromuscular, integration type movements that you see, Ryan doing in some of his videos, but also, like out on the floor with his clients. And they hover around some of they hover around what looks very much like maybe physical therapy meets yoga, meets Pilates, meets, something like almost Tai Chi in a sense. It's all very controlled. It's very deliberate. And, maybe we'll just want to talk about that for a second because we spend a lot of time talking about it, and we've got a lot of videos and a lot of instructionals on it, but I think it gets lost on people because they don't know, number one, what it is, why they're doing it, but also where to put it in. Like, where does this fit in? Going back to like, where do those floor movements fit in for you? Well, at the beginning, this is where they fit in.
Yeah.
A week in, this is where they fit in. 3 weeks in, it fits in here. A month in, we might not be doing those anymore, as an example.
Yeah.
Maybe it takes you 6, 10, 12 weeks to graduate. But again, the idea is to graduate.
So are you more talking the Eldoa piece? Or
like Eldoa, like the FRC, functional range stuff, that kind of thing. Just kind of in if we could kind of wrap it up and, as Stephen would say, tie a bow on it.
Yeah, I mean, so quickly with that, I mean, there's stuff to go on of what's the order of improving mobility or movement to allow this. Again, it needs to eventually be integrative. So something like Eldoa, right? This elongation of specific joints, right? If something that is overlooked is overhead mobility, but then a lot movement of the scapula around the rib cage and the thorax is thoracic mobility. I think that's something that's a lot of times overlooked, right? If someone is super, super kyphotic and round, that scapula's not going to move around that, right? That it's just not going to function.
Lockdown.
So something like an Eldoa is very, very targeted. I mean, there's Eldoas for every joint in the body, and there's extensive, and they're focused, and they look a little weird, but they can improve mobility at T8, T9, which is one of the biggest. It's the largest degree of kyphosis in the spine, right? So. And there's lots of different exercises like that. On the other side of things is things like FRC or functional range conditioning. A lot of that is CARS, controlled articular rotation. So these exercises are more working at strengthening the joint through every range of motion. So that can be isolated to the scapula. That can be more integrated with the whole shoulder girdle or the glenohumeral. Yep, the humerus. So, and these exercises are more specific, but they also can be a strengthening exercise, but they can also kind of continue to be that assessment of where do you struggle, where's the strength limitation, where's the motor pattern limitation, where do you lack in position, especially in the shoulder of like control the scapula in that specific, in let's say a shoulder car. So these exercises can be progressed, but they're also a great way to continue to increase your mobility or be that priming exercise over time. So
yeah, there's a lot there, and I wanted to make sure that we put that in there because people listening go, yeah, but what about the things that they're lacking otherwise? This could be a 10-hour podcast and we still wouldn't cover it all. So just wanted to bring that up so that I could bring it all back. Like if you're trying to build shoulder strength, you're trying to build just strength in general. Shoulder strength is going to be important for your pushing, for your pulling, for any of your athletic endeavors. If you're on the mat, the court, the pavement, on your bike, on your surfboard, skis, snowboard, shoulders are important, right? Whether you're actively using them to make the activity happen or you're using them as a safety mechanism, like if you're snowboarding, they're hanging out until you fall, right? They're helping you stay stable while you're knuckle dragging down the hill kind of thing. But you want nice stable shoulders and nice strong shoulders to get you through there, and you want to look good when you're naked too. So there's a lot of call for why we wanted to talk about this today. But in terms of your progression, we provide a ton of resources for people to get better at these things and learn a little bit more about them at even a deeper level. And so part of that's the podcast. But if you go to, I mentioned the YouTube channel. If you go to Red Dot Fitness on YouTube, our channel there, we have multiple libraries of there's over like 400 exercise videos in there. If you're looking for shoulder videos, they're in there. Shoulder strengthening videos, they're in there. They're all over the place. We also have, which I mentioned within that library, is the mobility library. And so when you look in there, you're going to see the things that Ryan just talked about in detail. And these are not like, while the exercise demonstration videos to give you maybe some ideas or some inspiration if you want, or like, just like to be able to program a little bit, they're there. They're free. You can have them. Go get them. Those are like 10-second videos. you know, with a detailed description of how to do it properly at the bottom in the caption, but we don't spend 20 minutes teaching you how to do a Viking press or, you know, an overhead press. Because we know that'll bore the hell out of you, right? We just want you to know how to do it. And if you have further questions, you can look into it deeper. But on the mobility stuff, this is actually like an active walking you through the process, which is not as commonly understood as, say, some of these exercises, or I wouldn't say it's as user-friendly, right? You have to think about it a little bit more. So in those videos, you're actually being walked through how to go through an entire repetition. So some of these things last as many as like 8-10 minutes, right? So you can get into it. So go to the mobility stuff there. If you're looking to get into programs that kind of pull it all together, like overall strength, power, athletic performance, we have basically like a pathway to get there. If you haven't heard about it, our most popular strength and muscle building program is RDF Strong. And then one of the graduate program to that would be our other program, which is more specific around building max power and strength and athleticism. And that is RDF Max. And all the stuff that we're talking about is built into those programs. And so if you haven't gotten into those programs, you're interested, I'll tell you how to get there in a second. The other one, if you're into our online membership, we built both the strength training stuff in there in multiple different programs, actually 7 different programs. One of those looks very similar to our RDF Strong program. The other one looks very similar to our RDF Max program. Those are continually progressed. Those are progressive. We constantly update those. But you'll also find a mobility program in there. And so we introduced this stuff. Going back to the 400 odd videos or whatever that we have, those are all built into all of those programs. So if you want something that's more like, let's say, periodized, that's like our Strong and Max program. Those are 4-month programs, right? They're periodized a month at a time. You know what you're doing at the end, right? Because you can see it. Again, there's a very specific graduate process, if you will. Not that you couldn't start with Max. You can start with Max, no problem. Go ahead if that's what you want. But ideally, you're doing Strong to Max, depending on where you're falling into the game. You can go to rdftrainonline.com, or you can go directly to those programs, rdfstrong.com, rdfmax.com. But if you go to rdftrainonline.com, you'll see all those options. And so there's a lot of different ways to get this information when you jump in there. If you're thinking about Strong or Max, I'll give you a code for 20% off. Just put in Strong 20 or Max 20 on those respective programs. You can get 20% off those programs. On the online membership, if you go there, all you got to do is download there's a free week pass there. And then once you're into that, you're going to get an email from us and we'll give you 20% off. We're putting that in there this month. So if you download that free week pass, you're going to hit with a 20% off basically code or coupon in order to upgrade that. If you wanted to continue, you don't have to put any money down on that membership or anything like that. It's super simple. We just give you access to our app. You get in there, you see all those programs, you can take your pick. That might give you a better understanding of maybe what's inside Strong and Max if you really like that. If you like that, I like templated stuff that I can see longer term, and all that. I don't want to deal with the app stuff. I want to print these things off, whatever. Well, then Strong or Max are your answers. So go check those out. rdftrainonline.com. Guys, thanks for your time today and talking with me about shoulder stuff.